Okay, so today I'm going to explain how we convert between fractions, decimals, and percentages. So here we have our fraction, here we have our decimal, and here we have our percentage. So the first thing I'm going to show you is how to convert from percentages to fractions. Now, the most important thing to remember is a percentage is always out of 100. If you remember this, then changing percentages to fractions is very, very easy. So, for example, 37% is the same as 37 out of 100. And it's as simple as that, really. For 64, it's 64 over 100. However, this time, we can cancel our fraction down because 64 and 100, they're both even numbers, right? So we can simplify this further. So this could go to 32 over 50 because we divide by 2. We can then do this again, can't we? And that's going to give us 16 over 25. If we have a decimal in our percentage, then it's still the same thing, 42.9 out of 100. But we don't normally have decimals in a fraction. So what we want to do is times this by 10 and times the bottom by 10, because that's going to give us a whole number on the top. So we'd have 429 over 1000. And so that's how we change percentages to fractions. So just remember to always put it over 100. Next, to convert percentages to decimals, we do the same sort of thing that we was doing before with converting them to fractions. So 3% is the same as 3 out of 100. Now, this is also the same as saying 3 divided by 100. And to do 3 divided by 100, we have the number, let's do it over here, let's have the number 3. And then we take the decimal point and we move it back once and twice. So our answer is going to be 0.03. So that will be our decimal. For 35%, it's the same as 35 over 100. And that's the same as 35 divided by 100. And if we do the same thing, we take the number 35, move the decimal point back once and twice. So our answer would be 0.35. And lastly, we do the same thing again. 65.7 over 100. That's the same as saying 65.7 divided by 100. So we write our number out, 65.7, and we move the decimal point once and twice. So the decimal point now ends up over here. So our new number is 0.657. And that there is how we convert percentages to decimals.
So now you know, or you remember, how to convert percentages to fractions and how to convert percentages to decimals. If we needed to convert decimals to percentages, is very, very easy because the first two numbers after the dot tell me the percentage. This would be the same as multiplying the decimal by 100 and you would obtain 34, right? We just need to multiply by 100. Oh, or look at the first two numbers of the decimal. Remember that if you have 0.5, the first two numbers would be 50%. And you need to be careful because if you have 0.05 will mean 5%. This doesn't mean that it is 5%. Remember, it's the two numbers. Or you just multiply by 100. If you do 0.5 multiplied by 100, you get 50. And if you do 0.05 multiplied by 100, you will get 5. So this would be 50% or 5%. If you had more decimals, like this number over here, you can just multiply by 100 and you will get 45.678. or just take the first two numbers and then put a decimal dot, and that would be the percentage. So if you need to change percentages to fractions to decimals, it's very, very easy. But why do we need to change percentages to decimals to fractions? The first thing and the most important thing is that we need to know they are equivalent, right? To say 0.5 or to say 0.5 or to say 1/2 or to say 50% is exactly the same thing, and we need to make that make a point of remembering that, because sometimes in the middle of an exercise we are told 50% and we don't know how to work with it. And the second important thing is that we need to know this and the equivalences, because they will help us with the calculations. Even more when we use calculators, because now you're not using a scientific calculator, so you will not be able to enter a fraction into the calculator, but you could enter a decimal. So if you could work with decimals, you could use your calculator. So now we will try to remember how to calculate percentages. First of all, we need to find a percentage of a given quantity. What would this mean? Find, for example, 80% of 25 or 75% of 125, right? So how do we find a percentage of a given quantity? We have different methods to do it. And last year you learned how to use regla tres simple, because Leandro told me that you did, and you learned how to calculate using fractions, but you just need to remember this. So we will use this problem as an example. It says that a test has 120 questions, and that to pass or to have a passing mark, you need to answer at least 80% of the questions correctly. So the question is, what is the minimum number of correct answers needed to pass? So the thing I need to calculate is 80% of 120. I will show you these three methods, but you might have another. There are many other methods that you can use, right? So if you have another method, then I will ask you to share it, please. If you use the fraction method, what will this mean? You will take the 80% and turn it into a fraction. This would be 80 over 100. When we simplify this, we could just cross 1 0 to make it, we divide it by 10, and we make it 8/10, and this would be 4/5 if we simplify, right? Remember that a fraction of a number becomes a multiplication. It's what I taught you in Spanish when we said 4/5 de los caramelos. It becomes a multiplication. So this is the same thing. 80% of 120 would mean 4/5 of 120, which means 4/5 multiplied by 120. Here you can simplify 120 divided by 5, right? You can divide this by 5, you obtain 1. And 120 divided by 5, you obtain 24. And 24 multiplied by 4 is 96. So this means that you need to answer 96 questions out of 120 to get a passing grade. Answer correctly, right? So this is one of the methods, using fractions. Regla de tres simple is directly related to this. Regla de tres simple often seems like a magical tool that solves everything, and that's magic, just magic. And it works because it works, and it works because it calculates it exactly in the same way as the fraction method. It's just that we write it in a different way. In regla tres simple, if you remember, you need to write in one column the percentages and in the other column the quantities. So 100% we know is the total of the 120 questions. And if we need to calculate 80%, we will put it on this side. Here we usually write a little line. 80% is, we don't know, we put X. And then the calculation that we need to do is, on the crossing, you multiply, and when you come back, you divide. So the calculation that we need to do is 80 multiplied by 120 divided by 100. But here, if we simplify, we can cross this, cross this, cross this, cross this, and we get 12 multiplied by 8, which is 96. You can do this slower, but I did it fast so that we can get the answer. So it's the same thing. You're doing the exact same thing. 80 multiplied by 120 divided by 100. It's the same thing that multiplying 4/5 by 120. The other method is the decimal method. Now that we know that a percentage can be a fraction, but it can also be a decimal, we could do directly convert 80% into a decimal, which is 0.80 or 0.8, which is the same thing. And then we do the same that we do with fraction, 0.8 multiplied by 100. This is the method that you should use, or that it's convenient when using a calculator. Why? Because you can easily do 0.8 multiplied by 200 by 200. No, me confundí. Sorry, this is not 200, it's 120. And here it's 120. Sorry. So 0.8 of 120 is the same as doing 4/5 of 120. That little word of converts into a multiplication. So you can easily in your calculator do 0.8 multiplied by 120, and then you will obtain directly 96. And this is very easy to do when you are shopping, for example, or in the supermarket, and they tell you, you have 70% off in the second unit you buy if they are the same. Well, that calculation, you need to do it quickly in the supermarket. And what do you have in the supermarket? Your phone. And what do you have on your phone? A calculator. So that's the easy way. Can you think of another way of solving this? There are many ways of solving this, but I can picture two more. Do you have two or something or another method that you would use? Or sometimes we have in our minds ways of doing things mentally that are easier than doing calculations. If you have one, please tell us. One other way of thinking of this is finding 1% of 120. How do we find 1% of 120? We do 120 divided by 100. Once we find 1% of 120, we just need to multiply it by 80 because we need 80%. This is another way of finding a percentage, right? Or you could do 10%. If you find 10% of 120, this is very easy to find because you just divide by 10. If you divide by 10, you obtain 12. And you need to multiply 12 by 8 so that you can get 80%. These two are very easy to use for mental work. However, if we need to calculate things that are a little bit more complex, you would need to use either the fraction method or the decimal method or regla de tres simple. Remember that this is one of the things that you will learn in math that you will use forever. If you ask anyone in your family what did you learn in school in math that you use forever and ever, they will tell you regla de tres simple or percentages or something related to this. What happens when we need to write a given quantity as a percentage of another? What does this mean? For example, it says in a group of 85 students, 65 study economics. Calculate the percentage of students who study economics correct to one decimal place. Remember that this will appear very often because they will ask us to round our answers. So we know that the total amount of students is 80. So we know that 100% will be 80. That is what we need to identify. And then we want to know 65 students, what percentage of the total does that represent? So one way of doing it is using regla simple. We will have the quantities and the percentages. So if we know that 85% represents the 100%, 85%, no, 85 students represent 100%, and we want to know 65 students, what percentage do they represent, we just write quantities on one side, percentages on the other side, and when we cross, we multiply, and when we go back, we divide. So we should do 65 multiplied by 100, all of that divided by 85. If we do that calculation, we will get 65 by 100 is 6500, divided by 85 is 76.4705882. But they ask us in the problem to round to one decimal place. Remember, this is the first decimal place, so this would be 76.5% because we have to round up. You could use decimals or fractions or both at the same time. Remember that a fraction tells you that 65 out of 85 students study economics. When we know that 65 divided by, we do 65 divided by 85 and we get 0.76470588. If we need to convert this decimal to a percent, what did I tell you at the beginning of the video? We take the first two numbers and put a dot, and then we need to round. This would mean 76.5%. Or you do this calculation and afterwards multiply by 100, and you will obtain the same number. So when we need to find what a quantity, we are given a quantity and we need to find what percentage of another quantity that represents, we need to do one of these two methods. Does anyone have an idea of another way of solving this? When we work with percentages, we have always many different ways of solving our problems. So every way, not every way is correct, but every correct way that you find is fine. I will not ask you to solve it in a certain way. I will not make you use regla simple and I will not make you use another method. So if you want to always use regla simple, you can do it, but I will teach you all of the different methods because sometimes some methods are more convenient for a certain type of problems than other methods.